All right, Dr. Spear, I think we can get started.
That sounds excellent. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I want to thank you for your patience this morning. We ran into a couple technical issues here that we seem to have worked out. So first and foremost, thank you for your patience in that regard. Secondly, today we are looking very broadly at special education, also with the focus on Ecuador and on TESOL, so teaching English to speakers of other languages. If you are not from Ecuador or you don't teach English to speakers of other languages, I believe you'll still find today to be rewarding, so hang on in there. And finally, today's workshop is a little bit long. So if at any point you find that you need to step away, either because you have another commitment to which you need to attend, or because frankly you just need a drink or to go to the bathroom, feel free to do so. We will have a recording available. In addition to that, after the workshop has concluded, I will also share the slides with everyone in attendance. And you can certainly feel free to share them with others as well. There will be a great deal of ancillary or extra materials available for your consultation as well. Some in the form of PDFs, others in the form of recorded interviews with experts, as you'll see later in the workshop. And of course, as you'll also see, I really like to include links on my slides. So almost everything is clickable. All right, with that out of the way, my name is Troy Spear. I'm an assistant professor of English and linguistics at Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida, in the United States. And I'm also an invited professor of linguistics at Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. The title of today's talk is an overview of special education in Ecuador with a focus on TESOL, a workshop for teachers. So I want to begin here with some of the information that we find in the articles from the United Nations, right? If you don't speak Spanish, no problem here. I'm not going to read it aloud in Spanish for you and embarrass myself. But what we find in Article 24 is a set of statements regarding education and the rights to which everyone is entitled. In particular, I guess I will read a little bit of Spanish here. In particular, this article begins by saying that we are recognizing the right of people with disabilities, right? Los Estados partes reconocen el derecho de las personas con discapacidad a la educación. And if you look just two lines later, it also says los Estados partes asegurarán un sistema de educación inclusivo. And this is really important. Inclusive education, this idea of inclusion, right? We're going to talk today specifically about what that means. But what we find in Article 24 is sort of the ideal conceptual approach to education. There should be inclusive education for everyone. In 1A, we are supposed to sort of ensure and develop human potential, a sense of dignity, reinforce self-esteem, because these are fundamental freedoms and rights of individuals. Now, this, of course, does not mean that we always find this, but this is, as I mentioned, the ideal that we are looking for. Also down in 2D, you see here it says se preste el apoyo necesario a las personas con discapacidad en el marco del Sistema General de Educación para facilitar su formación efectiva. So you are supposed to provide the necessary supports. And oftentimes this does not happen, not because teachers are unwilling to provide support, but because frankly, they might not know how. And so I'm hoping that today we'll be able to talk in detail about what this kind of support actually looks like and what kind of little steps you can begin taking every day in your own classroom, or if you train teachers to ensure they can do exactly the same. It's important to note as well for our attendees from Ecuador that this article was confirmed and ratified by Ecuador about 14 years ago, right? So this is something that should be implemented, but as you may well know, oftentimes is not or is not entirely implemented as such. So this is the ideal situation. It has not, of course, always been that way. So I'm going to begin here with an American example because I am, of course, an American after all. So in 1919, there was a court case led by the parents of a boy named Merritt Beatty, who went by the nickname Bud. So his parents sued the school, in particular the Board of Education in this city called Antigo, which is located in Wisconsin. And if you look up this city on Wikipedia, you'll find that there are only about 8,000 people. It's very, very small, right? But Bud had cerebral palsy. And up until fifth grade, he was doing really well in his classes. He was attending a public school. And oftentimes his teachers described him as being intelligent, right? He learned how to read and write at a much younger age than some of his counterparts. However, Marrett's cerebral palsy caused drooling, facial contortions, and speech problems. And as a result, you'll see here that I've emboldened and put in yellow a particular section that's important for us. The school officials claimed that this condition nauseated the teachers and other students, right? It made them feel sick to their stomachs. It required too much teacher time. So the teachers are spending too much time with Bud and not with the other students. And it negatively affected school discipline and progress. So it's because of Bud that the discipline and of all students happen to be suffering. And this, of course, if you've ever worked with students with disabilities, you know is not the case. But this was the perception. It led to Bud being kicked out of the school. And the Board of Education attempted to send Bud to a completely different school with students who were deaf, right? So Bud had cerebral palsy and was being told that he had to go to a deaf school. And this led to a major court case. In addition to that, in my home state of Pennsylvania, there is, or used to be, a hospital. It still exists, called Pennhurst, right? Went by the name Pennhurst Asylum. It has become a place that you go to in October if you would like to be scared during Halloween. The idea is that it is haunted, right? There are lots of stories. In particular, I heard these during one of the interviews with an expert on special education who had been teaching for 35 years, who said that students were routinely sent here. They were chained up to the wall and forced to sit and sleep on hay, on dry grass, right? So we're not talking about a particularly positive educational experience. But this is an important place for us to begin, because the chief physician at this hospital, Henry Goddard, ended up influencing the approach to special education globally in a very negative way. So Goddard said that every feeble-minded person is a potential criminal. And by feeble-minded here, we mean a student with a disability. So he's beginning this statement by saying that every person or every student or every child with a disability is someone who is dangerous to us. This is somebody of whom or in front of whom we should feel fear. And it's from Goddard that we actually have these labels, idiot, imbecile, and moron, that are widely used today as insults. But at the time when Goddard was in charge of Pennhurst, these applied specifically to what physicians or teachers believed the mental age was of a particular individual. So if someone who is 40 acts like a 1 or 2-year-old or has the intellectual abilities of a 1 or 2-year-old, in the terms of the physician, this person was an idiot, right? And all the way down in terms of these other these other labels that we have, imbecile and moron as well. So we're beginning with that because this is wrong, right? This is absolutely not the way that we want to approach special education, and certainly not students or grown adults with disabilities. This is the United States, right? But the situation in Ecuador, to be perfectly frank, is not that much better. So I had a personal communication with a slightly above middle-aged mother of a now adult child with a severe learning disability, and oftentimes medication that causes the symptoms to become worse in many cases. And so I asked this mother, if you could reflect on that situation, what do you think was the most frustrating? How did it feel to have a child with such severe disabilities in school? And what do you wish that the teachers actually knew? What do you wish they knew about your son instead of simply seeing the disability, right? And she said, Para mí fue una situación muy difícil, triste y frustrante, pero tenía que apoyar a mi hijo a salir adelante pese a las adversidades con respecto a su salud, las académicas y sociales. Son muchas las experiencias dolorosas que por la misma pureza de mi hijo confiaba en sus compañeros y algún momento le rompieron el brazo en un juego. So at the very beginning right here, she says it was very difficult. It was sad. It was frustrating. What she wanted to do was support her child in the face of this adversity, right? She wanted to be able to support his health, his academic and social progress, but there were many painful moments here. In fact, at one point, some of the other kids in school actually broke her son's arm while playing, but she doesn't feel, based on this wording here, that it was simply an accident. Y una lucha constante con los maestros para que le den más tiempo para que termine sus exámenes, porque él sabía la materia y no alcanzaba a terminarlos. En primer lugar, yo creo que los profesores deberían prepararse para saber manejar a estos niños especiales. So there was a constant battle, a fight with the teachers, just to try and get more time for her son to be able to complete, in this case, his exams, but probably more broadly, any of his other assignments as well, right? She wishes that the teachers were able to be better prepared so that they know how to interact with and best support students just like her son. Son niños que están bajo tratamientos médicos y toman medicamentos que los limitan sus facultades para poder estudiar. So sometimes you have to take medications, and those medications might also negatively impact your ability to concentrate in school, to do your work, to reach the highest standard that you can. Creo que todo eso debe ser tomado en cuenta. Espero haber aportado en algo mis experiencias que nunca terminan. So it never ends. This is an ongoing struggle of parents of kids with disabilities. So from the perspective of a teacher, yes, this is frustrating, but here is a firsthand reflection from a parent whose son progressed through primary and secondary school with a severe disability. Right? So moving forward, that certainly doesn't sound positive, neither did the American example. What are some of the things that other students have said when they were polled through the Harvard Project on Disability? Things like, I was taught in a separate classroom. My only classmates were kids with disabilities. We got babyish material to work on. I wanted art, but our class never got it. There was no bus, so I didn't go to school, and I never was taught to read. We're talking about a tendency in many places globally that continues for students with disabilities to be separated from their counterparts, who we call typically functioning, right? Those students without a diagnosed disability. They're being given material that is way below their abilities, right? It feels boring, it's too easy, they're not challenged. But in the same rate, they're not given opportunities to express themselves artistically. There might not even be public transportation, so they sit at home all day long and don't go to school. Or they might not be taught how to read, right? Because if people look at you and they don't see a lot of potential because of the prejudice that they have towards students and people with disabilities, they might not think that it's worth their time in order to teach you how to read. So the very first takeaway that we want to get from these negative experiences is the idea of kindness, right? Kindness is igniting a light in someone else for no reason other than to watch them enjoy the glow. So if you take nothing else from today's workshop, please let it be that we need to shift our focus so that we are always, especially in these educational contexts, even if we're frustrated, even if we're annoyed, even if we don't have a lot of time, even if we've had a bad day, to be kind. And this begins with something that we call people first language. So at least historically in the United States, you would refer to an individual, a child, a student, in the way that you see on the left here. So for instance, you would say the autistic child. This is in fact the way that many older people still speak, but the shift here has been to something called people first language. Because at the end of the day, there might be an individual, a child, a student, as we see here, a teenager, a man or a woman who has a disability of some sort. But once you take away that disability, you still have a child, a teenager, a student, a man, or a woman. So we want to begin by putting the person first. So instead of saying the autistic child, we say the child with autism, because that child is still a child. The autism does not define him or her exclusively. In the same way that when you look at me, you could say, oh yeah, the white guy, or the white professor, or the white teacher. But there is more to me than just being white, right? So people first language, that's what we want to strive for. Because even though these labels help us recognize meaningful differences in the ways that students learn and any accommodations that they might need, sometimes these labels are used in explanatory or stigmatizing ways. So for instance, if you have a student who has autism and that student does not perform well on a test, sometimes people will say that student did not perform well because he or she has autism. That's not the way that we want to approach this kind of situation, right? That's explanatory and it's stigmatizing, because when students hear this, and students hear a lot of what we say, we're not aware all the time of what they hear us saying, but it can negatively impact their self-esteem. And if they've been told or if they've heard that this is the reason they did poorly on assignments, they might not try on assignments, because for them, they see themselves in this deep, dark hole out of which they can never leave. So for instance, as well, the abbreviation for special education in English is SPED, S-P-E-D. And in the past, I remember this as well, even in the 90s, I would hear people use this term on the bus just to refer to students with disabilities, and also those who perhaps did something that was not all that bright. So for instance, if I were walking down a flight of steps and I tripped because I'm clumsy. In the 1990s, some of my friends would say, oh, look at you, you're a SPED, right? Insinuating here that the only reason I fell is because I had a disability. And this, of course, is stigmatizing, it's explanatory, it's pejorative, and it's offensive, right? Students with disabilities can accomplish much more than we give them credit for. And so with that introduction out of the way, our plan for today is very large, as you can see here. We're going to start by defining some of the key concepts, right, in special education. We're going to talk about some of the services available to students with disabilities, in particular in the United States. If they're not available in your country, these are things you might consider implementing, not because the model is best in the United States. It's not. There are many things that need to be fixed, but because maybe you'll find a way to improve it as well. We'll talk about different types of disabilities, along with the history of special education in Ecuador. And if you're not from Ecuador, I'd strongly encourage you to look into the history of special education in your own country, as oftentimes these mirror one another. Before finally, we talk about a few key myths about special education and ELLs, English language learners, before focusing on some more concrete instructional strategies and sharing some resources for your consultation. So just to begin with a quick caveat, this is of course me. This face resembles an awful lot the guy you're looking at right now. I am not a special education teacher by profession, right? I do not work 40 hours a week exclusively with students with disabilities, right? However, I am someone who is trained and certified to teach English to students in grades 6 through 12. So we're talking about students around ages 12 to 18 in 3 different states in the United States. And in order to become certified, I had to complete formal required coursework in special education. And as a result of that training and my prior work as a middle and high school teacher of English and language arts, I've worked with a significant number of students with disabilities, right? So today's workshop is contextualized not by a full-time teacher in special education, but by someone instead who's really passionate about this particular issue. And that's because in this new picture that you see here on the left, there are three people. I am the one on the right, my dad is the one on the left, and down in the very bottom is my twin brother. I mentioned that this is an issue close to my heart, and it is because that crazy looking guy there, my twin brother, he received academic accommodations for all of primary and secondary school due to a learning disability connected to his reading comprehension. And so while I was in school, I spent a lot of my free time in that classroom, helping him to learn, and to be perfectly honest, learning to teach from him, because we don't recognize that students with disabilities have a lot to offer us, right? A lot that they can teach us. So this is our caveat before we begin. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, this set of slides has many clickable links. So once you get the link after the workshop finishes, please feel free to go through, click on anything you want. It'll bring up websites, it'll bring up a Google Drive I set up, it'll bring up recordings of interviews with experts, it will take you to songs on YouTube. This is really interactive for you after the workshop concludes, right? In addition to that, though, this is not a substitute for formal training in special education. If you can take a course, please do it, right? And of course, working in the field is the best training possible. So take the opportunity to work with students who have disabilities. Key concepts, what are they? Well, first and foremost, there are four terms that oftentimes are used interchangeably: impairment, disability, handicap, and at risk. These four terms do not mean the same thing, even though oftentimes teachers themselves and in the academic literature, you'll find scholars mixing these terms up with one another. So an impairment is the loss or reduced function of a particular body part or organ, right? So for instance, you may have noticed that I'm wearing glasses, right? And we're going to talk about what these glasses actually do for me beyond simply help me see better, but I have reduced functioning in my eyes, right? This eye right here, at least from my side, my left eye is pretty good, right? But this one over here is really lazy. It has no 3D vision, and I can only see peripherally, right? This is an impairment. I have reduced function in this eye. That is not, however, the same as a disability. A disability is when that impairment impedes a person's ability to perform certain tasks, meaning it makes it more difficult or it prevents you from being able to accomplish something. If you, for instance, do not have any hearing, right? This is an impairment. Without using hearing aids, you would have a disability, right? Even with the hearing aids, you would still be identified as having a disability because it limits your ability to hear, right? A handicap is a problem or a disadvantage that a person with a disability or impairment encounters. So I'm reminded of this really, really great movie called CODA. And CODA stands for Child of Deaf Adults. And so sometimes a child will be born to two parents who are deaf. And in a situation like that, parents who are deaf might encounter a handicap that is a problem or a disadvantage when they go to school to talk with the parent or to talk with the teachers of their child because they can't hear, right? Without having an interpreter or without seeing it in writing, this is a handicap. And finally, if a student is at risk, this means that he or she has a greater than usual chance of developing a disability. This could be genetic, right? A genetic issue that makes a student or a child predisposed to be at risk of developing a disability. It might be because sometimes there are multiple disabilities that coincide within the same child, right? If you have one disability, you're at risk of having another, more so than someone without a disability as at risk of developing one. And so three other terms that we oftentimes use, accommodations, interventions, and modifications, are once again used interchangeably, but are not the same thing. They have very different goals. They have very different appearances. They have very different outcomes. So accommodations level the playing field. What this means is that if you and I are running a race together, but I have a broken leg, an accommodation might allow me to start running before you, right? It tries to level that playing field so that it's fair, right? So that I'm not always at a disadvantage. Because a lot of your students with disabilities might feel that they are at a disadvantage. So accommodations level that playing field. They help students learn the same curriculum as their classmates. So the curriculum's not changing, right? The assignments are also not changing, but they might be presented in a slightly different way. So if you have a student who has difficulty reading, for instance, because of a visual impairment, the text might be presented larger. So instead of Times New Roman 12, which is teeny, teeny, tiny, it might be Times New Roman 30, so that it's bigger for that child to be able to read, right? That's an accommodation. It's the same exact curriculum, but presented differently. If you have a child who has difficulty reading in general with comprehension, you might rely on audiovisual materials, perhaps a recorded version of that text so that the student can listen to it, for instance. You might have a designated reader, somebody to read the text aloud to that student, perhaps even to read the instructions aloud, to receive copies of notes from class, because that student might not be able to take them as quickly or might not have the ability yet to identify what should be written or not. Maybe to be able to respond in a different kind of form. Instead of writing an essay, maybe putting together a pamphlet of some kind that still meets the requirements, but is presented differently. Using a calculator, a spell checker, maybe working in a quiet room or a room with different lighting, or having more time on an assessment, right? These are accommodations, the same exact curriculum, but they level the playing field by ensuring that students with disabilities still have a chance to succeed, and to ensure that they have the opportunity to succeed on their own terms, right? By demonstrating their mastery in the way that is most appropriate for them. Interventions, on the other hand, ensure the playing field, right? So what we mean here is that they have to guarantee that that playing field is even an option in the first place. Interventions attempt to mitigate or lessen the effects of disabilities on students' learning. And we're going to take a look in the following slides here about what interventions look like. These are really good for all students, right? Not just students with disabilities, but by ensuring the playing field, you are helping all students learn. And finally, modifications create the playing field. So they affect the type and the difficulty of the curriculum offered to students with disabilities. So a modification might be a different homework assignment entirely, might be different test questions or projects. This could come in the form of an evaluation that is a different rubric or different academic standards for that student. Oftentimes in the classroom, we finish one unit and move to the second unit, but students who are not prepared to do so might remain on unit one. This is a modification until he or she demonstrates mastery and then can move on. And finally, maybe being excused from certain types of assignments, projects, or other assignments. So what kinds of types of intervention are there? Well, first and foremost, there are preventive interventions, right? And I'm going to put all three of them here: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary preventive interventions focus on the population as a whole, and they attempt to mitigate factors that could contribute to disabilities. So a primary preventive intervention is something for the entire body of students, right? Every student in that school. This is an attempt to limit anything that could contribute to a disability or make a disability worse, right? To limit what students can accomplish. We want to avoid that, right? Primary preventive interventions do that. A secondary preventive intervention focuses on a smaller group, right, a sample of that population that might be starting to display characteristics of a disability. So if you have students who are having difficulty writing, and this writing is perhaps caused by something like dyslexia, mixing up the letters, right? Once you can identify those characteristics, a secondary preventive intervention would focus just on those kids to make sure that they get what they need. And tertiary preventive interventions focus specifically on those students with the identified or diagnosed disability, and once again, attempt to mitigate those contributing factors. So as you see here, preventive, we're trying to mitigate, we're trying to lessen the impact of anything that this disability could cause in terms of the experience of that student and his or her ability to learn. Remedial or rehabilitative interventions focus on providing students who have those disabilities with the skills necessary for independent and successful functioning in academic, social, self-care, and vocational settings. So in the case of Ecuador, for instance, for our attendees from the country of Ecuador, Ecuador does a great job of this, right? Adults with disabilities oftentimes have certain protections in the workplace, and you oftentimes find more equitable representation. You don't find this globally, right? Oftentimes, adults who have disabilities are sort of forgotten or sometimes taken care of by the state or stuck in these institutions where they're not given much support. Remedial or rehabilitative interventions avoid that completely, because what you do through this intervention is you see the person first, the person as someone with value, with a contribution to make, even if that contribution is different. So you help that individual develop those necessary academic, social, self-care, and vocational skills. Things like, for instance, bagging groceries, knowing that you don't put a heavy gallon of milk, or how would you buy milk, I guess, maybe in a liter, right? Or a heavy box of milk on top of eggs, knowing that you don't do that, right? This is a kind of vocational training. Self-care, knowing how to shower, how frequently to shower, or social interactions. How should you approach people? Should you just run up and give somebody a hug in every context? Probably not, right? So these interventions focus on those really practical skills. And finally, compensatory interventions focus on providing students who have disabilities with alternative skills, approaches, tools, and technologies to compensate for any limitations caused by a disability. So for instance, right here, these glasses, right? This is a compensatory intervention, right? This is an alternative technology for me to be able to see. But because we're in the 21st century here, that might also come in the form of a larger technological device that will blow up, that will make the text appear much larger so that you don't need to print separate paper, right? Compensatory interventions. And this all contributes to something that we call RTI, response to intervention. And we won't spend much time on this. This is something I'd like you to take a look at on your own after the workshop when you've had a chance to sort of settle down. But you'll notice at the very bottom here, it says Tier 1, universal, 80%. 80% of the interventions that we actually implement or should implement in a school are good for every single student. And this is important because when we stop separating students from the beginning as students with disabilities and typically functioning students, but instead see the student body, we can ask, what kind of intervention would be good for everyone? Because oftentimes those interventions are good for the entire group, right? Famous saying, I guess, or common saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So here's an example for you that I made up from my sort of chaotic mind. I love zombie movies, zombie games. Maybe you do too. If you don't, we'll be done with this very quickly. But I want you to imagine that there's an event that happens in 2063. And I'm calling it the Great Zombie Apocalypse of 2063, right? I want you to imagine that it just started. Unfortunately, you have a broken leg and you're not prepared to defend yourself from becoming dinner for a zombie, right? Because of your broken leg, you are more likely to be eaten by a zombie. So what kind of accommodations, interventions, and modifications are actually available for you? Well, an accommodation might come in the form of you learning how best to defeat the zombies, but doing so, that is getting that extra training in a separate room, free of the terror outside. So you don't have to go outside and learn how to defeat the zombies by actually doing it, but instead you might have training that's in a quiet room, a safe room that doesn't have any zombies anywhere nearby. It's not violent. You get to sort of just do it without that terror. Interventions. Instead of having to run away on foot, because remember, you have a broken leg, you'll be given a four-wheeler to drive, right? A quad, so that as you're going, your broken leg doesn't prevent you from being successful, because you should have the opportunity to be successful as well. Finally, modifications. While your colleagues are outside taking care of the zombie killing, you'll be given different responsibilities, right? You won't be responsible for defeating the zombies, but you might instead be organizing all of your resources. You might be organizing the food, or making sure you have the weapons you need, or checking in on people who might be injured, right? You have a completely different set of responsibilities that are still rigorous for you, but that, similar to an intervention, allow you to demonstrate your success as well, your mastery. And so access to educational resources is not consistent globally. We can think of this sort of as a continuum, right? All the way on the left, we have exclusion. All the way on the right, we have inclusion. So oftentimes, perceptually, exclusion is seen as the worst and inclusion is seen as the best. You might recall that at the beginning of this workshop, we mentioned that the United Nations encourages inclusive classrooms, inclusive education. So what does that look like and how does it compare to the others? Well, in a situation where you have exclusive education, just as we see here in this image, we have all of the typically functioning students here with the white dots in that circle, right? All together. And then the students over here in yellow, purple, and blue. These are students with disabilities. They are excluded. They are kept out of that classroom. In fact, they might even be kept out of that school. They might be sent to a completely different school where they don't interact with people who are typically functioning. They might be at a school with people who have completely different disabilities, so they don't get the support that they need, or they might not even be in school at all. Segregation. Once again, we have all of the typically functioning students in their own circle. However, for segregation, we have those students with disabilities all together. Frequently, you will find this in schools where there might be a separate classroom where students with disabilities spend most of their day, right? So for my twin brother, for instance, he was not one of those students, but he had classmates who were in a separate classroom together all day, every day, without interacting with the rest of the students. Integration is when you bring those two together, right? So in this situation, you have, exactly like my twin did, a classroom where you might go to get some extra help with your reading, maybe particular for reading in history and in science, or maybe you'll get some extra help with math. But the rest of your subjects, you're together with everyone else. You have gym, your physical education together. You have your health together. You have your art and music together, right? You have lunch together. You try to integrate students as much as you can while still ensuring that you can provide them with the appropriate accommodations, interventions, and modifications. And the final type here is inclusion. This is the one that the UN advocates for. you have all of the students together, right? There is no separate classroom, there is no separate school, everyone is together. And in this context, you will find that there will oftentimes be aides in the classroom, a special education aide or a special education teacher. So in the past, I've had English classrooms where I would sit down at the end of each week with the special education teacher who co-taught with me, right? We taught the class together, and we would decide, this is what I want to do, and this is how we'll tailor it. This is how we'll adapt it for the students in the class who have disabilities, because we still want them to be a part of it. We still want them to be exposed to the same curriculum. We still want to encourage these social skills among everyone, but we don't want to set the bar so high that students cannot achieve it. And so what we aim for is something called the LRE, the least restrictive environment. So what we're aiming for is a setting where a child who has a disability can receive an appropriate education that is, of course, designed to meet his or her educational needs, but in an environment where he or she is surrounded by these other students, right? At the very bottom, we have the one I just mentioned, co-teaching, for instance, in blue here, general education with accommodations and paraprofessional support, right? Compare this all the way up to the top, outside placement. This is where you send the kids to a completely different school. That's not what we want. That is not the least restrictive environment. And for most students, that is really just not appropriate. It's not necessary at all. So how do we get there? We said that 80% of these interventions are good for everyone. So what does that actually mean? Well, we talk about this concept of differentiated instruction. And the first thing you need to know is that differentiated instruction works for all students, not just those with disabilities. Because if 80% of those interventions are good for everyone, then you would expect that the students with disabilities would benefit perhaps just as much, maybe more than the students who are typically functioning, but everybody benefits. And so differentiated instruction is three-pronged, right? It has three parts: content, process, and product. For content, in order to ensure that we are actually using differentiated instruction, we might ask, what kinds of materials are used? Are they at different reading levels or different lengths? And are any supplemental materials provided? As you'll see today, I will be providing supplemental materials because my goal is to differentiate instruction here, right? Some of those come in the form of checklists for particular kinds of disabilities. Some come in the form of academic or scholarly publications, right? Some are audiovisual. My goal here is to ensure that if a workshop like this, which is not very interactive, is not the best way for you to learn, that I've provided a different way of getting to that content. Process. How is the material actually presented to students? And is that instruction scaffolded for students' learning, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3, so that students can get where they need to go. For instance, in the case of a writing assignment, process might involve pre-writing, so brainstorming, and then making an outline, and then a rough draft, and then doing peer editing, and then submitting the final copy, then revising it again, right? Looking at the process. Are any other resources available to supplement or support that instruction? And finally, the product. What are students actually being asked to submit as an evaluation of their learning? Are these products presented at low, middle, and high levels of readiness? And are learning or choice menus available? If you don't know what those are, I'm going to show you in just a minute here, but students oftentimes can display their mastery in different ways from one another. So while one student might excel at writing an academic essay, another student might do a much better job, a much stronger job creating a podcast series, right? So the product forces us to consider what kind of work we are willing to accept from students in order to evaluate how much they've learned, because we want to give them some choice, some ownership in that process, right? And we do that by using these learning or choice menus. And so I've written here that learning or choice menus are kind of like a bingo card, right? If you've ever played bingo, you know that there are many different ways to win. And that's the goal, right? Nobody plays bingo thinking, I want to lose. No, you want to win. But there are many different ways that you can win at playing bingo. I've put some arrows here for you, and I can't even really, let's see, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, another 5, 10, 12 different ways you could win. And I might even be forgetting some here. 12 different ways just immediately on this slide that you could win at bingo. In the same way, students can demonstrate their mastery differently as well. The key point is that using a learning or a choice menu, which is a kind of differentiated instruction, which is good for all students, students with disabilities and students who do not have disabilities. The rigor is not sacrificed. We are not trying to simplify assignments. We're not necessarily trying to make them more fun either, because students find fun in different kinds of assignments. But instead, our goal is to give students choice in their, or choice in, or ownership over how they can actually demonstrate their knowledge, their understanding, their mastery, their ability to do something with that topic. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are lots of links down here. If you go back through, you'll be able to click them. Example choice menus. I oftentimes do this with exams, right? I just made an exam, for instance, for my graduate students. And as far as I can tell, there is nobody in there with a diagnosed or identified disability. But I don't need that to differentiate instruction because it's good for everyone. So in making that exam, there are different sections of the exam with different options, different ways students can respond. They can select which they would like to respond to as long as they reach the same number of points, right? There are many roads to Rome, but we're not all taking the same one. And so that differentiated instruction has been codified, right, into something called the Universal Design for Learning. And this UDL, as it's commonly called, is a framework that teachers intentionally use to provide flexible options within each of the curricular elements to address students' different learning needs, right? So students who have a visual impairment of any kind might have difficulty using text-based or textual materials. So UDL, or implementing a UDL curriculum, would give those students different options, maybe using videos, maybe using digital text so that they can actually hear it, right? Many different ways to present the material, but still following the curriculum, instead with the goal here of ensuring representation, engagement, and expression. That's our objective. And some guidelines have been created for this, for the UDL, the Universal Design for Learning, right? On the left-hand side, you'll see here from the top down, it goes access, build, internalize, goal. So at the very bottom, when we look at this, this is how we'll know if we were successful, right? So if we're talking about the first one here in green, engagement, if we're giving students a variety of ways to engage with the material, to participate, to demonstrate their mastery, we will find at the end that we were successful if students seemed or appeared or acted motivated, if they functioned with a purpose, right? Because they selected a way of demonstrating that mastery that gave them a sense of purpose. So how do you do that? Well, starting with the access. What are you actually trying to accomplish through the instruction, right? You have to begin by asking yourself that so that you can provide options to ensure that interest. Because you need student buy-in, right? If students don't buy in, they either won't do the work and fail, which if you teach primary or secondary school students will be a problem because then you'll be talking to parents, But if you're working at the post-secondary level, if you're not getting student buy-in, there might be apathy in the classroom, and then you are left with a dead room where nobody wants to talk, right? So beginning by asking what you're trying to accomplish through that instruction ensures the interest. When you ask yourself how you can actually accomplish that, right, the thing that you want to accomplish during instruction, then you can sustain effort and persistence. How do you keep the students motivated, right? You might highlight or heighten the importance of the goals or objectives for that unit, not simply by saying, you'll need this when you get older. Or if you teach math, math is everywhere. You're always going to be using math for money, when you get paid, when you have to go to the store, when you pay your bills, et cetera, et cetera. Most kids don't care about that, right? In the same way that if you teach secondary school students and you tell them this is really, really important, and if you don't follow along, just wait till you get to college because your professors will not tolerate this. That's not true either, right? You don't know all of the professors, and it's not a good motivation. What we want to do is try and ensure intrinsic motivation. And you won't be able to do that with every single student, if we're being honest. But by using the universal design for learning, this UDL approach, by modifying our curriculum to follow UDL, we can ensure that we're asking ourselves the right questions and students actually start to care. Plus, they have different ways to implement that learning. So the final step is internalize. How can I empower students in their own learning? Right? How can you promote expectations and beliefs that encourage that motivation? How can you facilitate personal coping skills and strategies? If students encounter an issue, do they just go, well, I'm dumb, I can't do it? No, our goal is to ensure that students can face that obstacle and go, all right, I can do this. Where did I go wrong? Let me use the resources at my disposal. Maybe I can talk to a classmate. Maybe I can talk to my teacher. Maybe there's a writing center if you work in the post-secondary level, right? Using those coping skills and strategies. And finally, developing self-assessment and reflection. So I'm assuming that most of us here are teachers. And as teachers, you know that reflection is actually perhaps the most important thing that you need to do in your job. It's not teaching, it's not grading, it's reflection. Because without reflection, you can't decide if your evaluation is fair. Without reflection, you can't determine whether your instruction is effective or not, right? Reflection is the key to all of this for you as a teacher, in the same way it is the key to all of this for students, empowering them in their own learning, right? And this continues with representation and action and expression as well. So sometimes it's difficult if you don't currently follow the UDL, but once you have this implemented, it actually makes your job easier because you can focus on the things that matter a little bit more than perhaps making those really detailed lesson plans every single week. Because instead, you're doing less lecturing, right? You're not using the transmission method as much. You're not opening the brain and pouring in the knowledge, but instead you're working as a guide. You're facilitating access to the information while, of course, presenting yourself as an expert on that topic if students need your help. All right, I know that feels like it was very, very long. We're moving into part 2 now, special education services. I hope you're all still with me. We got this. So what does a special education process actually look like? This is a model from the United States, right? You might not use this model in your country. In fact, you might not have a model at all. You might have a model legally that nobody follows, but this is the one with which I am most familiar. The very first step is to identify students with special needs or with a potential disability. When you start to see some characteristics, and that's your job as a teacher, right? You don't need to be a special education teacher to start picking up on some characteristics here, right? You'll communicate with the professionals about it and say, oh, this student I see is having trouble in this area, and I was thinking, maybe an evaluation would be helpful. Then that person, the professional in special education, might follow up, right? And that follow-up is assessing the special needs. So an actual evaluation. And as we'll see in just a minute here, the evaluation is comprehensive because oftentimes you'll have more than one disability at the same time, or you might have a disability that looks like a different one, but you need a trained professional to identify what is actually causing it, right? But once those needs have been identified, then an educational program will be implemented. This is something we call an IEP, which we'll see in just a minute here as well. But that IEP will guarantee in writing, and at least in the United States, that legally this student has these rights and that this teacher has these obligations in terms of providing instruction, evaluating work, and so forth. Okay. Keep in mind, when we started today's workshop, we talked about how horrible things used to be in the United States. This is a very big change, right? Very big change from where we were. And as we'll see in just a couple minutes here as well, Ecuador, exactly the same way, right? Once that IEP, that educational program or plan has been implemented, or designed rather, we implement it, right? And you'll see here that these last three steps, this is a constant feedback loop. So you plan it, you implement it, but then you have to evaluate it, right? You have to reflect on it. Is it working? What could work better? Are the goals realistic? What do we need to change? And so you'll go back and replan it, re-implement, reevaluate. And this is a constant pattern throughout a student's entire primary and secondary education, right? Because students with disabilities, just like every other person on earth, happen to be changing regularly, right? You are not the same person today who you were last year. And we would expect it to be the same for students with disabilities as it concerns their intellectual needs, their academic progress, and so forth. So that initial evaluation, once you've identified some characteristics, you speak to the professional in your school. Hey, I see this student who has these kinds of problems in class. I don't know what's going on. Maybe you can help. Now we have the evaluation. That evaluation will look at 5 different areas here. So cognitive and academically, how is the student performing? Is there perhaps a learning disability? Right? Is there an issue preventing the student from perhaps deciding or knowing what kind of notes to take, or even how a particular assignment might work, or even being able to read directions? Cognitively, academically, is there something that is preventing the student from being successful, right? There are tests in this regard for reading comprehension, for instance. In the past, schools almost exclusively used IQ tests, which of course are not very reliable for this kind of thing, but we start with the cognitive and academic. Then we look at the communicative. Are there perhaps issues that the student has communicating? So I have graduate students in Ecuador at USFQ, and they are studying to be teachers of English to speakers of other languages, but they're studying linguistics, right? And linguistics has an alternative career path called speech language pathology. So as a linguist, you understand, you learn how, first and foremost, the brain can communicate ideas to the active and passive articulators, right? What's your tongue doing? What are your teeth doing? What are your lips doing? Are you doing anything interesting with your larynx, right? Understanding how the body actually communicates language ensures that we can see maybe the student's having a difficulty where he or she is mixing up L and R, for instance, or L and W, or Y and W, or B and V, right? Are there communicative issues preventing this student from being academically successful? Behavioral issues. These are not oftentimes thought of when we think of disabilities, but there are behavioral disabilities. For instance, if you have ADD, ADHD, for instance, you might have difficulty staying on track. You might spend half of the class tapping your leg, or banging a pencil, or fidgeting with something at your desk. These are behavioral issues caused by something else. But once you identify that, then you can implement the appropriate accommodations, interventions, and modifications. Physically, Is there anything preventing the student from being successful? The example I gave earlier was a broken leg. That's not a disability, right? But there might be an issue where, for instance, a student is not born with one leg or without either leg, right? Maybe this is a student who was born with two legs but cannot walk, doesn't have the ability to walk. Maybe there's a spinal issue, right? Physically, maybe there's an issue with the brain, right? If there's an issue with the brain, this oftentimes feeds into the developmental aspect. This goes hand in hand with genetics, right? Genetically, there might be a problem that predisposes a child to develop a disability as well. So the evaluation is going to consider the student from all five of these different perspectives, right? So we're no longer saying the autistic child, but instead the child with autism, because that child might have issues in any of these areas or might not, but is still a child, right? So that evaluation will look at health, it will look at vision and hearing, social emotional status, general intelligence, academic performance, communicative status, and motor abilities, right? Motor abilities, for instance, dexterity with your hands. If you have difficulty writing, for instance, if you can't hold the pen or pencil the same way as other students, this is something that would be seen in that initial evaluation. And after that initial evaluation, you develop the individualized education program, the IEP, right? The Programa Educativo Individualizado, the PEI. And not every IEP will look exactly the same. Some IEPs are very, very long. They can be 20 or 25 pages. Others will just be a couple pages. But all of them will include generally the same kind of information. There will be background information on who this child is, where he or she lives, what the parents do, how old the child is, what classes this child is in, and so forth. There might be the present levels of performance and individual needs. So how is this student actually doing in class? In each of his or her classes, how is this student doing? What kind of needs do we see immediately that need to be rectified? What kind of outcomes do we have for this child once he or she becomes an adult? Thinking long term, what can we do best to support this child as he or she grows, right? Section 4, measurable annual goals and short-term instructional objectives. These goals might be things like improve the average score on, let's say, low stakes or low impact vocabulary quizzes by 25% this year, right? But they have to be very, very clear and they have to be measurable. Not things like we'll do better or we'll get a higher grade or we'll participate more, but very, very specific. Things like this child will participate 4 times every week. You can measure that. You can count them, right? Even just on one hand there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Perfect. We met that goal. Let's make sure we keep it up. Section 5 are the special education programs and or any other services or modifications that will be offered to that particular student. Section 6 clarifies if that student will participate in general education classes. So these are things like language, whether it's English, Spanish. I know we have some people here from the Balkans, so Macedonian, Albanian, Turkish, right? Will those students be in those classes? History, science, math? Will they be in the same classes as other students that are not academic? Things like gym, art, music, health. Will they be in those classes or will they be separated? And when it comes to extracurricular activities, will they be playing sports? Will they be in the band or the chess club? What will they be doing in terms of extracurricular activities? How can we encourage the student to participate? Section 7, these are the agencies for students who require transition services, right? So students, as they go from one school to another, from an actual school to a different school, or from one level to another, from primary to secondary school, for instance, or perhaps those who are graduating, who are going into adulthood. What kind of agencies or organizations are there to help those students? Section 8, What kind of activities are planned that will lead to the long-term adult outcomes? What do we expect this child to do, right? And here we want to be generous. We want to be fair, but generous, right? So in the same way that we are not using these labels as a way of limiting what students can accomplish when they get older, we do want to be realistic, right? So if we have a student who it seems will enter some sort of vocational profession, perhaps working at a supermarket. This is something I saw quite frequently in Ecuador, for instance. With that particular student, you might ensure that there are a lot more activities that focus on things like math, arithmetic, right? So that he or she can use the cash register appropriately, give correct change, do the math or use the calculator if it's there. You might ensure that you're focusing on issues related to dexterity, being able to pick up bags, if the bags are paper, plastic, or cloth, knowing what kind of things to put in which sorts of bags, right? Coordinating those activities. Section 9 will include information about graduation for that student. When are we anticipating graduation? Is this student on track? Then we have a summary of the selected recommendations, a list of oftentimes dates when parents will be informed of progress, when the next meeting will be, and then finally dates and signatures. So when I would go to these meetings, and if I had a student with a disability, I would typically go to 4 meetings every year because we divide in many American secondary schools the academic year into 4 quarters or 4 marking periods. So I would enter the room and I would be greeted there by a counselor, right? A therapist at the school. I would also be greeted by the special education teacher with whom the student worked. I'd be greeted by the student and his or her parents or guardians. Maybe only one could come, but at least one would be there. And I would be there with some of the other teachers that this student had. And I loved IEP meetings because I got to come in and I would just talk about English and I would get to be a real advocate for that student. I could talk about how great that student is doing in these particular areas and how much progress and growth I'm seeing here, how we want to keep working on this area, but we're getting there. And you can see that child's face light up because he or she knows I have an advocate, I have an ally, right? I said kindness is the most important, and we want to keep that in mind. When these students with disabilities, and all students, but particularly students with disabilities, when they see that you have their back, they're willing to work for you, okay? So there's some links down here for sample IEPs, the anatomy, and how to write some of those measurable annual goals. So what kinds of disabilities are there? Well, there are 4 main categories of disabilities, and there's not a clear line between any of these. Sometimes there's some crossover, right? So the first category, this contains intellectual or learning disabilities. So some of these you might be familiar with, things like dyslexia, as we mentioned earlier, right? Mixing up letters, perhaps not knowing which letter looks like which one because they look too close. P and B, for instance, right? Mixing those up with one another. Dysgraphia, this deals with the actual writing itself, or dyscalculia deals with math, not just that you're bad at math, but that there is an actual issue when it comes to recognizing the numbers and the different symbols we use to indicate addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, and so forth. But not all of these are so clearly defined. So the 4th one here is Prader-Willi syndrome, right? This is a genetic condition that causes some physical issues, but it's considered an intellectual or learning disability most of the time because it does impact the student's ability to succeed academically, especially without those supports that are needed. The second category contains physical disabilities, and these are oftentimes the ones that people think of first, right? Because these are arguably the most visible. If there is someone, for instance, with muscular dystrophy, this is very, very easy to see. Um, I have a very good friend whose son has muscular dystrophy, and I remember many years ago when he could walk. He seemed to look just like every other typically functioning kid, very, very bright kid, very sweet. But as the years passed, he gradually lost control over his muscles, right? They slowly started to atrophy. They lost their functioning so that he couldn't use them as well. He wasn't able to walk anymore, right? So having the support, the technology of a wheelchair that he could control with his hand, for instance, became very, very helpful. These are physical disabilities. These are things that you see that are easy to recognize. But oftentimes, we seemingly know less about these than we do about any of the others, even though they are the most salient. Sensory disabilities include things like if you are on the autism spectrum, if you are blind or you have low vision, you have a visual impairment, perhaps an auditory impairment, you may have lost your hearing completely or partially, or you might have a sensory processing disorder. So processing all of the sensories around you, things like everything you're seeing, everything you're hearing, maybe touching things, all of those senses are activated in a different way than they are for students who are typically functioning. And finally, there are emotional or behavioral disorders. We oftentimes don't think of these as disabilities, if you will, but I think if I had to speculate, this has a lot to do with the fact that in movies and on TV shows, especially those describing um, decades in the past, people with emotional or behavioral disabilities were oftentimes put in asylums, just like Pennhurst that we saw earlier. So bipolar disorder, depression and anxiety, schizophrenia, these are things that can be treated medically, right? These are, in the case of depression and anxiety, things that can be treated using therapy, using cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance. Anorexia and bulimia benefit greatly from the individual affected by one or both of these by going for therapy as well, right? So emotional or behavioral disabilities, they do have appropriate supports as well, even though you as the teacher might not be able to implement them as straightforwardly as you could some of the others here. What does special education in Ecuador look like? All right. First and foremost, when we look at the information available, the most recent data from the Consejo Nacional para la Igualdad de Discapacidades, the government says that there are 47,603 students in the country with any kind of disability, right? As you see here, they distinguish them according to intellectual, physical, auditory, psychosocial, and visual, right? Not exactly the same classification we just looked at, but they use the 5 here. The problem with this, however, is that that figure, 47,603, is only approximately 1.086% of students, right? And you might think, well, that seems about right. The reason it doesn't seem right is because La Organización de Salud Mundial estimates that 1% of all children alone are on the autism spectrum. So what that means is that either 1% of these 1.086% of students in Ecuador have autism, and the 0.086% remaining have something else, or the figures here are dishonest. And that's probably what it is. There's no way that mathematically these figures could be correct because the total number of students in Ecuador aged 3 to 17 was estimated at approximately 4.4 million. And that comes directly from the Ministerio de Educación del Ecuador, right? So the number is significantly higher than what we're seeing here. But you can certainly check this out yourself. I have links here as well so that you can access it too. Many countries have data like this, but the data oftentimes are simply not accurate. Sometimes this has to do with the fact that students are not often identified early enough, maybe because teachers are unprepared to identify the characteristics or uninformed about them, or sometimes because parents rightfully believe that their kids are perfect, right? And it's a really difficult conversation to have that your child might have a disability of some sort, and this can prevent that child from receiving the appropriate modifications, accommodations, and interventions as well, because you have to be identified first, right? But the point here is that the number listed is incorrect. It is far too low unless Ecuador is somehow the most magical place on planet Earth that does not have anywhere near the average number of people, in particular students here, affected by disabilities. Now, the history of special education in Ecuador itself, in the 1940s and 1960s, there wasn't anything codified yet. We don't really find laws. We don't find any sort of support for individuals with disabilities. But what we do find is that individual families start to create private institutions in order to provide charitable care to those with disabilities, right? Many years later, however, in 1976, there is a governmental resolution that results in the creation of 13 test classrooms. And these classrooms were essentially an extension of what we saw in the 1940s and 1960s, right? Sort of an opportunity to begin providing some kind of support, in this case, charitable care, but in an educational setting. 1 year after that, La Ley General de Educación was issued, and this was the very first time in Ecuadorian history where special education was actually noted, and not just noted, but specifically stated as something that should be offered. A year after that, another governmental resolution resulted in the approval of the first Plan Nacional de Educación Especial. So this is still, 1978 here, still very, very abstract and idealized. We see the following year, La Unidad de Educación Especial, same thing, right? We begin to have these laws implemented, these resolutions passed with these goals established, but not much is actually happening yet. In 1982, there is the first of many UNESCO-sponsored Seminarios de Educación Especial. And so this was held with the expressed goal to codify this. Instead of simply saying the government of Ecuador recognizes that special education is important, that students are entitled to get the supports that they need, instead to codify this at the national and regional levels. So in this province, this is what you need to do. In this province, this is what you need to do. Nationally, this is what we need to do. And towards that end, we have the creation of a variety of NGOs, right? The names are listed here over the side. In some cases, the language used is not considered politically correct anymore, but this was the first time, at least in Ecuadorian history, that we see organizations founded alongside these, these sort of more academic circles, the seminarios, to encourage these difficult conversations and really to enact change. So resolution number 134, just a year later, resulted in the creation of La Sección de Educación Especial, and another governmental sort of mandate here established this Sección de Educación Especial as a department that had to research, plan, program, advise, coordinate, and evaluate those programs, right? So in 1982, we codify the regional and national goals for special education. In 1983, a department is established that has to evaluate it, right? Also in 1983, we have the first workshop, the first national curricular workshop on special education, similar to what we're doing here today, right? But not very widespread. There weren't a whole heck of a lot of people who actually attended this first workshop. In 1984, another governmental resolution established El Sistema Escolarizado de Educación Especial, and then about 4 more resolutions were passed that finally listed some real plans and programs to integrate children with disabilities into the classroom. And so at that point, every province except for Orellana and Sucumbios, have their own special education institute. And on the other hand, in the Galapagos, they're focusing not on integration, but instead on inclusion, right? In 1984, inclusion, this is something that wasn't really happening in many places in the world. But as we saw from what the United Nations said in their Article 24, this is the goal. In 1991, inclusion starts to be implemented more widely because of the success in the Galapagos. And in addition to that, inclusion is more widely implemented because of the publication of Una Escuela para Todos and the Declaración of Salamanca, right? We also have El Plan Nacional de Discapacidades being published, so the national plan concerning those with disabilities. In 1990, there's a complete restructuring of the Department of Special Education, right? And I just realized now that I probably should have put that up there a little bit more. I do apologize for that. But in 1990, there's that complete restructuring because they're seeing that things are not working as well nationally as they are in certain regions. For a period of 7 years, from 1990 to 1997, more resolutions, more agreements are issued to ensure greater access to educational data, right? Kind of like the data that we just saw, even though it was inaccurate. We also see the development of a Department of Special Education in every single province, including Orellana and Sucumbios that did not have it before. We also find that there is an attempt to guarantee that students with disabilities have universal access to traditional schools and that those schools are actually providing services for integration, right? That's important because before 1990, there was still a large attempt in many parts of Ecuador to keep students with disabilities out of typical schools, out of traditional or regular schools, and instead to put them in different educational institutions. In 2001, there is the publishing of El Programa de Integración de Niños o Niñas con Necesidades Educativas Especiales a la Escuela Regular. This is supported by UNESCO and CBM International, with the goal here of ensuring that we know very clearly how students with special needs are going to be integrated in those regular schools. Now, that's not that long ago, right? That's 21 years ago. That's not a very long period of time. In fact, some of you, if you're training to be a teacher, might not be that much older than 21. So this is really groundbreaking. 1 year later, El Reglamento General de Educación Especial actually includes a chapter on primary and secondary education, specifically for students with special needs. And in 2003, we have additional publications that state, most importantly, that educational inclusion is a right. This is a natural birth-given right to all students, including those with disabilities. Every school is required to accept students with disabilities and to provide them any physical, pedagogical, and evaluative supports and adaptations that they need, as long as they are congruent with those needs, right? In agreement with those needs. That changed the game. You might not find this reflected in your school as such, but this has been the law for 19 years, that every single school in Ecuador must accept students with disabilities and provide them with the appropriate care. And as you'll see here, I won't go through the rest of these in as much detail, partially because we have quite a few attendees here for whom Spanish might not be a first, second, or any language, tertiary language, right? But also because we don't really find things here beyond some of those symbolic changes or the inclusion of a new chapter here or a restatement. For instance, in the new constitution, that people, individuals, students, and so forth who have disabilities are afforded these particular rights. But instead, in 2019, this is the next time we find an important change. El Ministerio de Salud Pública, so the Ministry of Public Health, publishes a text called La Calificación de la Discapacidad. And it's in here that we find these 6 types of disabilities recognized in Ecuador: auditory, visual, communicative, physical, intellectual, and psychosocial, which you saw reflected in the data. In addition to that, they also recognize that in addition to having one of these disabilities, you might have a different severity of the disability from somebody else, and you might have more than one disability concurrently, right? This is a really, really big change, because for the first time, the child is actually being put first, legally at least, right? Being put first, being afforded particular rights as a result of having a disability, and there's recognition that not all disabilities are the same, that they don't affect all students in exactly the same way, with the same severity, and that you don't simply have one disability and call it a day, but instead that some students might be affected by more than one. Some myths about special education and English language learners. It should not come as a surprise that because people oftentimes have their preconceptions about students with disabilities, oftentimes those that relate to intelligence, that if you are learning another language and you're struggling, there might be an assumption that it's because you have a disability. And this, of course, is not the case, right? In addition to that, the ability to speak English or not, or any language, is a measure of intelligence. It absolutely is not, right? So in the case of Ecuador, if you're teaching your students English, it might be a second language. If their first language is Spanish, it might be a third language. If their first language is Quechua, the second is Spanish, and the third is English. It might be a fourth language. If their first language is Guarani, the second is Quechua, the third is Spanish, the fourth is English. In the case of the Balkans, where some of our participants are from, you might have grown up speaking Turkish or Albanian or Romani, right? And then in order to succeed in a particular area, maybe you live in a neighborhood in Skopje, for instance, where Macedonian is more widely spoken, you learned Macedonian as a second language. Then you decide you're going to learn English. That's a third language, right? But at no point in the learning of any of those languages is your ability to speak it a measure of your intelligence. Another myth is that students who rarely speak have a speech delay or an auditory processing disorder. So if you are shy in class, you have social anxiety or something like that, that might be a reason that you don't speak that much. But there is a tendency for many people to believe, incorrectly of course, that if you don't speak much in class, it might be that you have a communicative disorder, right? In actually being able to produce the sounds, or it might be that you have an auditory processing disorder, that you have difficulty actually hearing what is being said to you and then processing it through your brain. That's also a myth. Students who don't understand spoken directions have a learning disability. This, of course, is not the case at all. As we heard earlier, differentiated instruction works for everyone, right? If you don't understand spoken directions that well, there is absolutely no problem with that. Maybe you need to see them written, and it's not because you have a learning disability. English language learners will get the kinds of support they need in special education classes. This is the sort of old model. It's too much work for me. I can't do it. Just send them to the other classroom. No, students, ELLs, or students of any class need to get some support in each of their classes. You should not simply pass them off and say, I can't deal with this. I don't have the training. It's your job as a teacher to inform yourself, to ensure that you're providing the support that you can in that particular classroom. And she can, of course, get that support from a professional in special education. Schools should wait a certain amount of time before assessing an English language learner for special education services. This is also a myth, right? So in the same way that learning English or any language and or your ability to speak it is not an indication of your intelligence, if you see any characteristics resembling a disability, you should immediately put in a recommendation for an evaluation. You shouldn't simply wait and hope that everything works out. All right, finally here, some instructional strategies. So what I've put here on this slide, and I'd strongly encourage you as you go back through the slides later to click on each of these images, right? Each image is a link to a YouTube video. All three are singers. So as we said, we want to focus first on the person, not the disability. With that said, we have three people here on this slide, each of whom has one or more disabilities. So Vincent, in the first one, he is visually impaired. The second one, Amanda, she has a speech impediment. And the third, Cody, he is both visually impaired and has autism spectrum disorder. All three are beautiful singers, right? So when we focus first on the person, then we can enjoy the music, right? As opposed to seeing the disability first and then going, oh my gosh, with a disability, how did you do that, right? Focus first on the person. As Amanda tells us, everyone faces trials and tribulations, but music is such a powerful catalyst for positive change. When words fail, music speaks, right? So even just listening to these songs will give you a different perspective on people generally who have disabilities. It will also give you a different perspective on the power of music, perhaps using music in your own class, not just as a form of mindfulness, perhaps, or as a starting point for a journal response or an assignment or something like that, but instead as a way for all of you as well, you and the rest of the students who are typically functioning, to recognize the person first. In the bottom right, we also have a document here about some social emotional learning strategies, because in the same way that some students with disabilities need particular kinds of skill development to ensure that they are interacting appropriately in social settings, most human beings need some skill development when it comes to interacting with people who have disabilities. So this works for all of us, right? On this slide, I've put together a whole list of some valuable resources for teaching and special education that you can use. So up at the top, these are my favorite, top 20 principles for teaching. And then next to it, we have addressing English language learners with disabilities. If you don't teach ELLs, no problem, but you might find that an interesting document as well. All of the ones that we have here in the middle, these focus on particular kinds of disabilities. How can you identify them? What are some of the characteristics? What are some of the supports that you can provide to students with a particular disability or set of disabilities? Down below, we have some indicators of hearing loss and vision loss, right? That might help you as well. And it's important to keep in mind that these checklists are helpful for you to see those characteristics first, so that you can make the recommendation to the professional that this child be evaluated. And finally, I know that for almost everybody in this workshop, English is not your first language. If Spanish is your first language, at the bottom, I've included here a glossary of terms about or broadly related to special education in Spanish. Similarly, because we want to differentiate our instruction, this slide here has links to 5 recent publications in Spanish that focus on issues related to special education, some of which take place directly in Ecuador, right? So this might be a valuable resource for you as well. And then finally, I have used almost 2 hours of your time this morning. I know you're tired of hearing my voice already, but if you are interested in continuing to learn more about this topic, and perhaps you are not a text-based learner, what we have here are 5 interviews. Each face is clickable and will take you to an interview with an individual who specializes in a particular area. So Evelyn Onapa, for instance, I always call her Mrs. Onapa, was my twin brother's middle school learning support teacher. And so we talked about what special education has looked like, what it could look like, how things have changed, what IEPs are like, and so forth. Ms. Rispoli was one of my coworkers the last time I taught high school English. She teaches a general education course, but has students in class with disabilities. So she reflects on that experience. Mr. Rubenstein was one of my co-teachers the last time I taught middle school, just a couple years ago. We taught together in an urban school, and out of a class of 20, about 20 of the, or excuse me, out of a class of 20, about 8 of those students had some sort of disability or combination of disabilities. And so Mr. Rubenstein and I would have to coordinate how we would teach all of the students, including his. Dr. Bittencourt down here is a professor of education at USFQ, and he talks specifically here about Ecuadorian education, so that if you are perhaps interested in how that structure works from the standpoint of somebody who was not simply a student through the system, you might like that one. And finally, Mrs. Jenna Sterner was my best friend in first grade. She's now a full-time teacher of students with visual impairments and blindness. And so if you're looking for a really heartfelt conversation, that is one that's worth listening to as well. So all of these are clickable, right? And will take you to the interview. The length is listed there as well. Okay, so with that, as I mentioned, I know I took up a significant period of your time this morning. I want to thank everybody again for taking Saturday morning, 2 hours of your time to share with me and hopefully to learn about your current students and or your future students. We are going to share the slides and the recording from today's workshop. But what I'm going to do now is stop sharing my screen so that hopefully we can end the recording. I can take some of your questions and I'll share the link right away so that we all have those slides too.